welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. A special welcome to the team from Ag Communicators and my colleagues also, and co-presenter Joe from ISC. So make sure you get those questions in throughout tonight's session. So just a little bit about tonight's agenda. We're going to go through the role of the Integrity Systems Company, the importance of the red meat integrity system, a little bit of a refresher on the integrity system programs, being livestock production assurance and the National Livestock Identification System. And then, as Dee said, we're going to take a deep dive into the final 4 LPA requirements. So we had a look at 3 of the LPA requirements in last week's webinar, and tonight we look at the remaining 4 of those 7. But don't panic if you missed last week's session. We'll share a recording to both those webinars in the post-webinar email. Next slide there, Joe, please. So just to start off with, where is, or I guess, where does Integrity Systems Company fit in terms of the red meat industry here in Australia? Well, Integrity Systems Company is a subsidiary of Meat and Livestock Australia, which is a service provider to industry. So MLA and Integrity Systems Company provide industry services. Now, the organisations in the top row are focused on policy and strategy. So they are responsible for advocating on behalf of producers to the various decision makers in the industry. They're often referred to as the peak industry councils, and they usually represent different sectors of the industry, be meat processing, live export, lot feeders, and then cattle, sheep and goats. The organisations there on the bottom row, they're often referred to as service providers, but on that whole slide there, all those organisations have separate roles, but work together to support the industry. Next slide, Joe, please. Now, Meat and Livestock Australia, on the other hand, or MLA, we're responsible for research, development and adoption and marketing activities on behalf of the red meat industry, so sheep, cattle and goats. We do that by collaborating with the Australian government and the wider red meat industry, and we invest in initiatives that contribute to producer profitability, sustainability and global competitiveness. And the way that we do that is we invest those transaction levies that are paid each time that sheep, cattle and goats are sold. Those funds are matched with Australian government funds up to a certain amount, and then those R&D funds or those levy funds are invested by MLA under the direction and advice of some of those organisations on the earlier slide in research, development and adoption and marketing activities. Next slide. Now, Integrity Systems Company, as I said, a fully owned subsidiary of Meat and Livestock Australia. We're responsible for managing and delivering Australia's red meat integrity system, which ensures that Australia's red meat is safe to eat and fully traceable. It provides on-farm assurance, animal identification and lifetime traceability. And it's the red meat integrity system that underpins the livestock selling system here in Australia. It gives confidence to buyers, retailers and consumers all around the world. And just to put that into context as to why it's so important that we have this red meat integrity system, the Australian red meat industry now is a very serious business. It's a serious contributor to the Australian economy. It's a $28 billion industry. It employs 400,000 people across 80,000 businesses, and we deliver product through red meat to 100 global markets all around the world. Next slide, Joe. So just as a quick refresher, there are 2 programs which work together to underpin the industry's food safety and traceability on farm. The first of those is Livestock Production Assurance, or LPA, and it's all about on-farm assurance, and that covers the management of food safety, animal welfare and biosecurity risks on farm. It's the tick of assurance for your product from producer through to consumer, and it demonstrates the professionalism of the industry and underpins market access for Australian red meat. The other program which makes up the red meat integrity system is the National Livestock Identification System, or NLIS, and it's all about identification and traceability. It tracks the location of every animal throughout its life. It's mandatory for producers and endorsed by major producer, feedlot, agent, sale yard and processor bodies. And it's also underpinned by state and territory legislation. And that's what gives us the ability to track livestock during disease or food safety incidences. Now, there are a couple of other elements that make up the red meat integrity system, which are really important. The central component of those is the property identification code, or the PIC, and that's required for all livestock producing properties, and it's also required for registration with both the LPA and NLIS. PICs are managed independently by state and territory departments of agriculture, and by incorporating PICs into LPA and NLIS, that's the only way that traceability and food safety can come together and be managed at a national level, by having a consistent program across all states. And the other two elements of the red meat integrity system, which are really, really important, are records. So record keeping for both LPA and NLIS, and it's record keeping that underpins food safety and traceability. And then, of course, the LPA National Vendor Deck, and that links on-farm assurance and traceability for livestock as they move along or through the value chain. Now, all of this is really important when it comes to the records that you keep as red meat producers. And it's really important as we go through each of the different elements of LPA. Next slide, please, Joe. And just to round out this session before we get into the different requirements of the Livestock Production Assurance Program, recent studies undertaken by Integrity Systems Company have highlighted that our key domestic and export markets continue to value quality and safety when it comes to choosing red meat. And when producers in Australia become part of the red meat integrity system, they commit to producing a product of a high quality and agree to manage their livestock and their properties or farms in accordance with those LPA requirements. The linkage of on-farm assurance through LPA and identification and traceability through NLIS is what brings quality and safety together. Now, the red meat integrity system supports our domestic and international markets, and because of this, our red meat products are trusted and highly sought after all around the world. And we recognise that there are multiple producers and many properties which make up the Australian livestock industry, but it's the red meat integrity system that's really about delivering one measure of quality through one system. And it's really important that we all recognise that we all have a role, regardless of the size or our location or the numbers of animals that we farm, that we all absolutely have a role to play to ensure that we could stand by what we sell. Next slide, Joe. So I've just given you a really quick refresher about the various elements that make up the red meat integrity system. Now we're going to go into some more detail around 4 parts of the Livestock Production Assurance Program. But Dee, just hand back to you for a quick sec.
Right, so as Kathleen and Dee have mentioned, we did cover the first 3 requirements in part 1 last Tuesday night. So this tonight is going to look at the final 4, but if you didn't make that first webinar, just to recap on what those first 3 are, which is the property risk assessment, safe and responsible animal treatments, and the treatment of stock foods, fodder crops, grain and pasture. So tonight we're going to move on to more about the movements of livestock, and then also preparation for dispatch, the transactions and movements, and then we'll also be looking at the biosecurity and animal welfare requirements of the program. Just if you are looking for somewhere else to see the whole program in all the requirements in one place, we do have the LPA guidebook, which we will send you a link to after the webinar, but also obviously the website's a great resource to see the whole, all 7 requirements together in one place. So before we launch into the, sort of the just preparation for dispatch and the transaction movements, we're just going to talk a little bit about animal identification. And actually, I've heard Kathleen start the webinar many times because we've done this webinar a lot of times, but I guess I was just really thinking how we're really stressing to people that the 2 programs are really intertwined. And I think for a long time, a lot of producers have seen LPA and NLIS as very separate programs, not really connected to each other, but it is really important that you see that they work together and that they're part of that one system. So animal identification is definitely part of NLIS, but it is really important that it's also part of LPA. So we're just going to cover off on that, and we'll also talk a little bit more about it in a couple, further down in the slides. So it is really important that all animals that leave your pick or leave an individual pick or a property, they must be identified with an NLIS accredited tag or device before they leave. So you don't have to tag them at birth. And so some people do tag early or tag them at branding, but they must have a tag before they leave the property or the pick. If you're moving an animal off its property of birth, then obviously you can tag with an accredited breeder device. So a breeder device is one it relates to that particular pick. And if they've not from that pick, they've come from another pick and this is not their pick of birth and they're leaving and their tag's fallen out, then they do need to be tagged with a post-breeder device. So we've got some examples there on the screen. So and the integrity insight down the bottom sort of tells you the difference between the two. So breeder devices or tags that relate to the pick where they're from, they're white, and for post-breeder tags, so tags that you apply to animals that are leaving a pick that's not their pick of birth, are orange. And for sheep and goats, the post-breeder tags are pink. And for sheep and goats, obviously the breeder tags, well, they're usually the colour of the year. So they have like a year colour scheme system. So whatever the year the colour that relates to that year. Cattle have to be tagged with an electronic device, and sheep must be tagged with an accredited, that can be electronic or visual, except in Victoria where they have switched to electronic devices for sheep. So there are some rules around that. So if you're from Victoria, you need to make sure that you know at what point you have to use those electronic devices. And all lambs or kids born since the 1st of January 2017 must have an RFID tag before they can leave their pick of birth. So if you do need more information about what's required in your state, then please have a look at your state requirements. So in terms of being prepared for LPA and to ensure that your integrity from your property and that you can stand by what you sell, what do you need to do about this? You need to make sure that you're prepared for when livestock are going to move. And that means when you have cattle or sheep or goats in the yards ready to go, don't wait until the truck turns up to say, oh, that one's missing a tag and I need to replace that, because that's not a great time to be stressing animals and trying to do things at the last minute. So always make sure you've got time to check that all animals have tags before they're going to be transported. And as I was saying before about, if you do need to replace those tags, make sure you have some spare breeder and post-breeder if you've got animals on your property that weren't born there, just in case when they come into the yards, they don't have their tag, so you have the right tag to replace their tag with. Because, and I'm sure plenty of people have found this out, when you do send animals to a sale yard or a processor without a tag, especially with cattle, it can cost you a lot of money for them to put a replacement tag in when they get there. They don't just charge you the going rate, they charge you quite a bit more. And so it's really worth your while to make sure everything's got a tag before it leaves. The thing about the electronic tags is that if they have lost their tag and they're no longer on their property of birth, then they have lost their lifetime traceability unless you've kept records and have a match management tag, or you have another way of identifying what tag that animal had before it was lost. So you do need to put a replacement tag in, and that will show, and I guess that's why they make it a different color. So when buyers are looking at animals, they can see if the tag is a post-breeder tag, they know that at some point that animal has lost its lifetime traceability. So getting into the actual requirement, which is requirement number 4, with preparation for dispatch of livestock. Why is it so important that we have this as part of LPA? And it all goes back really to a couple of things. So primarily food safety. So we want to make sure that there's no that the food, that the animals are not going to be stressed and it's not going to affect the food quality. But it's also a big part of animal welfare. We need to make sure that those that we're prepared, we're organised, and all the things we go to do to making sure those animals have a good journey, get to where they're going in a good condition. And, you know, obviously for yourself, you want to make sure that you're going to maximise the income you can get from them because they're turning up in a good condition. So what are the things that you need to do to make sure this happens is, again, don't leave things to the last minute. Try and make sure that you're organised so that you've got the time to be ready, so that if you've been able to let animals settle down in curfew, you've been able to separate them up so that when the truck turns up, it's not a big rush. Also that, you know, you've thought about what, if you've got multiple decks or, you know, loads to do, that you've split up the mobs into how they're going to truck. You do need to make sure that your loading facilities are suitable and the yards are maintained and fit for purpose and not going to cause injury or stress. And actually, when you do have, if you have an on-farm LPA audit, they do specifically look at your loading facilities because that is an important part of making sure you're meeting this requirement. If you're, for example, you've been, you know, treating animals with chemical, like you've been backlining or something, you need to make sure that that's not happened just before, and it's not going to, you know, there's no risk of there being cross-contamination between chemicals when animals are just about to go, especially if they're going to slaughter. And it is a good idea, if you can avoid it, to not mix animals that aren't familiar with each other so that they're all travelling in their mobs. Really, really important that you only select animals that are fit to travel, and we'll go into this a bit more in the next slide. You need to record the transport details, including the vehicle registration and key times, which you record on your NVD. And you definitely need to document and file your NVD. So whether you do electronic NVDs, e-NVDs, or whether you have a hard copy book, you need to make sure that you are keeping those records. So with eNVD, it's great because it's saved in the system unless you have printed it out and used a paper version. If you've done that, then you need to make sure that that record is being kept. I guess a really important part of this is, and it probably doesn't happen very often and probably not many people have had to deal with this, but if you ever do have an animal that's been exposed to a physical contaminant such as a broken needle, that information does have to travel with that animal. So you need to make sure that wherever it's going, someone knows that that is a situation with that animal, because that is a potential food issue. So that if that ever does happen to you, make sure that if you're selling that animal, that the purchasers or wherever the animal's going know that that is a situation with that particular animal. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the fit to load. So hopefully you've all seen this guide. If you haven't, we're going to send you a link so that you can download it. But it's also available well, I think you can order it for free. Actually, I'm not sure if it's free or whether you have to pay for the copy. But if you go to any event where MLA is there, it's normally there because it's probably the most popular publication MLA has put out. And it's yes, it really should be in the glove box of every livestock transport truck, because it does really make it clear exactly what you know, exactly what are the situations or the conditions that an animal can have when you can say yes or no, that animal is able to be loaded. So part of this is making sure that livestock are not stressed or injured prior to loading, and also adhering to the curfew requirements, providing appropriate loading facilities, providing advice to the transporter at point of loading on the fitness of animals, and making sure the movement documents travelling with the livestock have been completed. As I said, go through the checklist and the fit to load. You need to make sure that the animals can walk on their own, bearing weight on all four legs, and are free from visible signs of severe injury or distress. And there's photos in the guide that can help you make a decision if if that's something that's acceptable or not. But visible signs of injury like lameness, ingrown horns, scabby mouth, hernias, udder infections, eye cancers or disease, skin cancers, refusal to stand, fly strike, panting, and heat stress, and also late pregnancy. So you need to be really careful that you don't include animals on transport that have any of those situations, and sometimes things like ingrown horns and stuff can be hard to spot, so you need to make sure you take the time to have a good look and make sure that the animals don't have that. So if you do have animals, if you do end up having a situation where an animal is not fit to load, then you have to make the decision not to send that animal, and obviously, you know, seek out veterinary assistance if required, or you may even need to euthanize the animal. Just a little bit more on those curfews. So it is important you do not feed or water livestock destined for slaughter during the minimum curfew period. So for cattle, that's 6 hours, and for sheep and goats, it's 12. Choose transport operators who operate in accordance with the quality assurance program. So Truck Safe is probably the most well-known one, because the transporters that are part of that program, they are making that effort to make sure that they're, you know, meeting those standards. But if you're, you know, if whatever transporter you use, you know, make sure that they're competent and they have a good facilities, good vehicles, and that they're keeping their vehicles safe and clean, and making sure that they're going to give your animals the best trip that they can. So there is templates, and we're talking back about recording, that what are the recording that goes with this requirement. And this is an example of, with just the recently updated LPA template in preparation of livestock for dispatch. Now, all of this information is also captured on your NBD, apart from, I guess, the yarding time. So you can keep your NBDs as records. Not everyone goes to the effort of filling out these templates as well, but I think they're a really good idea, because it just gives you all your movements in one simple place, rather than saying you're getting an audit and they want to have a look at all your records. You've got them all there, rather than having to go through your NBD book. So it is important, especially that, and you probably won't, you may not have included this on your NBD. Well, you should have actually, but if there is any known risks, say for example, if you have the broken needles, so you definitely would have recorded that on the NBD, and if they're within a withholding period. So pretty much you do have these records. So just another column that two columns actually we've added to this template in the refresh of it. There's now a column to say, were the animals fit to load? And then this column beside that says, do all livestock have NLIS devices applied? So if you were going to use this template, it could be a good one if you've got staff loading for you, and just to remind them to make sure that all animals going onto the truck have a NLIS tag, and also just double checking that they have made sure that everything is fit to load. So moving on to requirement number 5, which is livestock transactions and movements. And why is it important that this requirement is part of our LPA? Well, basically, having doing this properly and keeping your records and following all the requirements for this section ensures that treatments and exposure to food safety hazards are traceable. So if there is a food safety issue, if one does occur and livestock are not traceable, then the source of the problem may be impossible to identify. So all livestock need to be fully traceable to allow a fast and efficient response. How can you meet this requirement? You need to record all livestock movements. You need to keep records of animals purchased within withholding periods or export slaughter intervals, and you need to document animals that may have been exposed to physical contaminants. So just going back to this slide is really all about where LPA and NLIS come together, because the traceability is through the NLIS system, but the information about the history of the animal and what it's been treated. So we talked about a food safety issue. If the food safety issue was to do with contamination, then they need to go back to the NVDs to see what's the history that goes with those animals. So we need the traceability, and we need the LPA information that goes on the NVD. So as I said in the last slide, you do need to complete, if you're an LPA accredited producer, you do need to use an LPA NVD for all transfers between different PICs. So that could be from, from your property to another property with a different PIC, or from your property to a sale yard or a processor or somewhere else. So even though in some circumstances, in some states, other movement records are allowed, if you're accredited with LPA, then you have committed to always using an NBD for all those transfers between different PICs. And the other thing you must do, and it's an agreement with NLAS, so it's a statutory requirement with your state, within your state legislation, but it's also an agreement you've made with LPA that you will make sure the transfer onto your PIC has been completed. Again, you are responsible for that if you are the receiver and the transfer is not being completed by a sale yard or a processor. If you're a receiver and the animals are coming from a private purchase, then you need to make sure that that transfer has been done. And the other thing about NBDs, it's really important when you're receiving livestock that you do keep those copies. So it's pretty easy to keep the ones that you're sending because you're either got them saved in your online in your ENBD or you've got the book. But for all the animals, the livestock that you purchase, make sure that you do receive an NBD. We've had questions, a few webinars lately, people saying, I didn't get an NBD, what do I do? Make sure you get one. You really need to have that information. And so always when you're receiving animals, make sure you receive the NBD and follow it up if you don't get one. So we're just talking about NBDs, and the most important thing that you need to do is make sure that they are clear, complete and correct. And we're going to go into a little bit more information about this and into the next few slides. So just going into some of the questions on the NBD that often the ones we're going to focus on are the ones where people generally need a hand. And these are the questions about animals' history, because most of the NBD is pretty easy to fill out, but the questions about animals' history sometimes trick people up. So it's really important that you get them right. And because this information is crucial for food safety and market access. So the key is to stay on the safe side. And if you're in doubt about something about food safety, then tick yes, so that you're declaring that there could be a risk with those animals because you're unsure. One of the updates to the NBD when the new versions came out last year was that the number of electronic devices in the consignment for sheep was included. And this is included because of the move to mandatory use of EID in Victoria, and it is being increasingly used in other states. So that was an addition. So don't forget to fill that in if you're filling in a sheep NBD. Another place where people get a bit tricked up sometimes is when the destination and the consigned to are different. You do need to write the name and the person, the name of the person or the business the livestock being transferred to. And you do, if the destination is different to that, then you need to write the full address of where the livestock will be delivered. And the destination PIC needs to be included. So destination PICs are mandatory in WA and Tasmania, so you do need to make sure you include them. Which I've just jumped ahead and already covered that. If you're wanting to complete the destination PIC and you don't know what it is, you can ask your agent and buyer before you're filling out your NBD. That's probably one of the quicker ways to find it. Otherwise, if you're using the ENBD, it has a great search function, so you can look that up when you're completing your ENBD. Otherwise, you can also look in the PIC register in the NLAS database. On the cattle NBD, it's really, really important to declare if cattle have been treated with hormonal growth promotants in their lifetime. And our integrity insight tip on the slide there is that if cattle have been treated with an HGP, that you must identify them with that triangular ear punch. So that's really important because HGP is one of the, can really affect a market if there was a mistake made and a HGP animal got through and accidentally ended up in a supply chain that didn't accept HGP animals. So that's really, really important. On the sheep NVD, you need to check records, your LPA records, like the treatment records, to see if the animals have been treated with a scabby mouth vaccination. So there's a question about that in a time frame. So you need your records to check. If you have bred the livestock question, probably the most common way this is answered incorrectly is people ticking yes and no. Because they might have a mixed consignment of cattle that they've purchased and that they've bred. So if any of the animals have been purchased, then you do need to tick no, and then the least amount of time, like the amount of time that relates to the most recent purchase. As I said before about if you're unsure, declare the risk. So if you're not sure about the chemical or the veterinary treatments, if they're in a withholding period, if they've been fed, fodder that was in a withholding period or been treated with something, then declare the risk and tick yes and say there is risk because you're not sure. That's why you need to keep really good records, because the only way you can answer those questions is if you have the records to back that up. Something everyone should know when you're a red meat producer is that animals are not allowed to be fed RAM, because this is part of your declaration. You're declaring that none of the animals have ever been fed RAM products, which are animal products, which include meat and offal, animal fats, blood, meat, bone, or blood meals. So it's really important that you make sure that is the situation for your animals. The declaration, it is a statutory declaration, so like it's a legal document. You do need to fill it out carefully, make sure it's complete and correct. And the declaration pretty much is your guarantee that you're meeting the LPA requirements and that everything has been completed correctly, and that the animals again have not had access to restricted animal material. And NVDs are definitely part of what's audited when you have an LPA audit. They will be looking to see, have you completed your NVDs correctly? So just before, when I talked about a mixed consignments, you may have a mixed consignment between bred, homebred and purchased animals, or you could have a mixed consignment in any of the other questions. So some animals have had a treatment, some haven't. If you don't want to declare the risk on the whole group, you could divide them into groups based on their history and complete more than one NVD, but you would need to be able to identify and separate those animals and be sure that the receiver is happy with that situation and that they know that there's some animals in their consignment that have a different history to other animals. So we've been talking and looking at examples of the hard copy NVD. So now we're going to have a quick discussion or a quick review of the ENVD system, because this is the easier and the more time efficient way to complete your NVD consignments, all your consignment paperwork, not just the NVD part of it. It is mobile friendly, and it is available to everyone that's LPA accredited, so to producers, feedlots, and to value chain stakeholders. The great thing about ENVD, and this was a real benefit for when we did the changeover in the versions, that the ENVD always is the latest version. So in the future, if we do have another change of NVDs, the ENVD, the day that it changes, it'll be the correct version. So you never have to worry about having the right version. The way that the ENVD is set up and the way that you can use it, it really does save time, because you don't have that duplication of trying to using the same information over and over for different forms. I think I've mentioned a few times that the benefit of having your records stored. So when you complete an ENVD digitally and it's stored within your ENVD part of your LPA account, it's all there online for you. You don't have to go back looking for hard copy books, and it's always available, even in emergencies. So if you, for some reason, you usually use an NVD book, but you can't access it, then the ENVD is your go-to for getting an NVD done quickly. The other great thing about ENBD, and I've just seen this as I've been working at ISC, I've seen the team who are on, they're all on the call tonight. They are really committed to improving the system based on feedback. So they get a lot of feedback, and thank you to everyone who has have given them feedback, but they are constantly working on how to respond to things that don't, that people don't find working for them, or that if there's a glitch or something going wrong, they really try and get onto that and have put a lot of effort into making a much better system. Just to recap some of those benefits. So as I said before, it's not just for completing your NBD, it's also where you can complete your health declarations, if you're feedlotter, your NFAS, and if you're MSA accredited, you can complete that as well. So all the information that's common across the forms just gets entered once. So that means you don't have to write it out over and over. You can set up templates for common consignments. So if you're sending livestock regularly to a particular location, or even regularly you're sending the same class and type of livestock, you can set all those templates up. So you just go, this is what I want to do, and it's pretty much all mostly filled in. You just have to answer those other history questions. The ENVD can be printed at any time. So if you don't want to complete it completely electronically, you can print it out at any time of the consignment, so you can complete the rest of it in hard copy. The great thing is it's really set up for mobile phones, because most of us, that's how we operate these days. So it's the right size, all the screens and everything work really well on a mobile device. Easy to read, I think a lot of, when we've talked to transporters and to sale yards and to processors, that is really important, because not everyone's handwriting is that easy to read. Whereas on an ENVD, it's just totally clear. There's no ambiguity in what something's, been written down, and they don't get lost because they're saved in the cloud. The other thing we mentioned with the previous webinar was currently, or came in on the 1st of July. When you use ENVD now, it does make you eligible for a discount on your LPA accreditation or reaccreditation. So it's good to have a look at that. It's called Go Digital with ENVD. And if you're doing your accreditation, make sure you have a look at that option. So just thought we'd show you what it looks like when you use the ENVD. If you haven't used ENVD, so if you haven't, you may not have even been in your LPA account. So this is a screenshot of what the LPA website looks like. You access ENVD through LPA. So you, as we mentioned last webinar, you now need to have a My MLA account to access LPA. And we'll be sending you resources on how to set up a My MLA account if you haven't already done so in the post-webinar email. But the other thing about ENVD is that you can actually access it directly. So we'll also include the direct link to ENVD, so you can just open it up with a direct link. But once you're inside your LPA account, you can see the ENVD menu tab right at the top there. You just click on that, and then you end up on this page. So this is like the home screen, and it's asking you what would you like to do, and if you have a template, you've set up a template, you can use that. Or if you are starting from scratch, you click the Create from Scratch option. And filling in your ENVD, you enter the movement information details, where the livestock are moving from and to, and what date they're being moved. The movement date can be up to 28 days into the future, so you can plan for upcoming consignments. Select a species, then select the livestock forms you require. So as I mentioned, it's not just NVD, it's the other forms are available to be included, but you must at least have an LPA NVD as part of it. The other forms will be visible if you are in that program. So if you're not MSA accredited, you're not going to see the MSA option, but as soon as you are accredited, then those options become available to you. Once the details have been entered and you've chosen the types of consignment forms you're completing, you can print 3 copies and complete the rest of the information at the yards, but you must retain that fully completed paper copy for your records. So you need the 3 copies as you would for the hard copy book. So one for yourself, one for the receiver, and one for the transporter. If you are completing online, step through the livestock history, food safety, chemical treatment sections and complete the declaration. If you're signing it electronically, you only need to sign it once, and that signature is then applied to all the forms which have been filled out in the consignment automatically. When you sign the ENVD, you are declaring that your livestock are meeting the LPA requirements. So it's exactly like the hard copy book. It's a declaration, you're signing it, that's your guarantee. With ENVD, you can submit, after submitting, you can make changes to some certain sections up to 2 days after the entered movement date. So if you haven't used it, I really encourage you to get on and have a look. Just create a test consignment, have a look and see what's involved, and then you'll be ready if you do ever actually need to use it. You know, if you want to have a go at using it regularly, or just in the case that you may need to use it just unexpectedly, at least if you've had a look first, then it's not going to be so foreign for you. So the other part of the livestock transaction and movements is recording the movements in NLIS. So as we mentioned before, that the receiver is responsible for making sure that those transfers have been completed. And if you are selected to participate in an audit, then an auditor will review your transfers to see if they have been recorded on the NLIS database. So they'll be looking at, they'll be asking to see your NVDs for livestock received, and they'll be making sure that those transfers have been completed, and vice versa. They'll look at the transfers on the database and make sure that you have an NVD to match up with them. As mentioned before, also it is state legislation, so NLIS is part of every state legislation that you do have to complete that transfer, and there can be penalties imposed by your state or territory government. So here's a template, and it's recently updated for livestock purchases and movements. Again, most of this information is on your NBD, so you may choose to use your NBD as the record. So all of that information is on your NBD, but if you want a sort of a consolidated place to keep them all together rather than having to go back through your filing cabinet, because these are the for cattle that have, livestock that have come on, it's really handy to have one place, because often you are going back to look for that information for other reasons. So moving on to requirement number 6, which is biosecurity. So here we're going for time. I've just speed it up a little bit. So why is this requirement an important part of LPA? Because it's having a biosecurity plan, or having biosecurity component as LPA, is the way that we can help prevent the spread of infectious diseases and invasive pests or weeds, and that helps protect Australia and Australia's red meat reputation. It also helps protect your livelihood, because getting caught up in a disease outbreak or pests and problems can really impact on your productivity. So it's partly our reputation, but it's also because it does have an impact on your bottom line. An emergency animal disease outbreak such as foot and mouth would have massive consequences for every person working in our industry. And I guess frontline people like producers, staff that are working with livestock every day are actually our best defence in managing the spread of disease. So it's really important everyone's observant and vigilant and know what to do if you suspect a problem. So what do you need to do to meet this requirement? You need to keep a formal documented farm biosecurity plan, which can be completed digitally in your LPA account. Now, remember, your biosecurity plan is relevant to your property or your farm. So every farm and property is different. So the risks that you have that you need to consider about, and that you need to manage, the biosecurity risks that are relevant to you will be you need to think about what's relevant for your situation, and it's not just a cookie cutter plan. You've got to think about what's relevant for you, because that may not be relevant for other people. If you can, make sure you can receive a livestock health declaration or an equivalent for any introduced livestock, and have systems in place to notify authorities if there is an unusual disease, illness or mortality. So the emergency animal disease hotline number is there. It's really a good idea to have a record of that, and that everyone on the working with livestock knows that number, and they know to ring it if there is symptoms of something serious. And keeping records of movements of people, vehicles and equipment that enter your property where it is reasonable and practical to do so. This is an example of the template. So you can have this in a Word format or in a PDF, but it's also can be completed online. So there's two sets of records that can be completed completely online within your LPA account. The first one was a property risk assessment, which we covered last week. And the second one is a biosecurity plan. Because these two types of records, you kind of do them, you need to review them annually, or if something changes on your property, but you're not kind of using them every day. So they're good ones to sort of put that effort in, make sure they're all done. And it's really easy to step through this in your LPA account and get that completed. We also do provide a template for a visitor register. So just recording the date, who turned up, where they're from, some contact details, why they visited, and what place on your property they went to, and some times. There are records that include a place for visitors to sign, but that's, if you have a biosecurity plan and you have templates that have other requirements, or you might have done one through your state DPI, that template might be slightly different. That's okay, but you just need to basically capture who's visiting and why, and the date and time. Oops. The seventh requirement area and the last requirement area is animal welfare. And this is important so that we can ensure that the handling of livestock throughout Australia and throughout our industry is consistent with the requirements within the Australian Animal Welfare Standards and Guidelines, which help make sure that we meet the expectations of customers and consumers around the world, because animal welfare is extremely important to them. And having these standards included in the program clearly communicates the Australian red meat industry commitment to providing excellent animal welfare outcomes, and helps provide that marketing advantage in a global market. If you haven't looked at them for a while, and I hope you all have, because it is a requirement of LPA that you are familiar with the what's involved in the standards and guidelines for whatever species you have. So if you have both cattle and sheep or goats, whatever you've got, you need to be familiar with what's inside those guidelines. I think most people would agree they're pretty simple to understand. Like it might seem daunting, like it might feel like it's going to be like legislation, but they're written in a really simple to understand and practical language, and they just really clearly define the roles that we all need to play to ensure the animals we're responsible for are receiving the best possible care. Now, one thing I'd like to really stress, if there is someone in your business or within your operation that's doing most of the paperwork, and they end up doing the LPA, paperwork and requirements and the learning and the accreditation, that's fine, as long as everyone that's in the business is aware of what has been agreed to and what the requirements are. And this is a sort of a classic one where whoever's done the accreditation has had a look at the standards and guidelines, but they haven't made sure that everyone in the business actually is aware of them. So it's really important that everyone who is responsible for livestock knows what's in these standards and guidelines, because that's who they're directed at. So it's about what you do every day with the animals that are in your care. So that's one of the key points. Make sure that staff are familiar with the standards and guidelines, and that they have been trained in a manner that are consistent with them. Obviously, regularly inspecting livestock on the property and having procedures in place to deal with sick or injured livestock is really important. So when you're audited, you do need to have a you need to show that you have access to this. You don't have to have a hard copy, but you just need to demonstrate that you have access to it. It could just be the online version, but if you've downloaded it, then you can make sure that everyone has been able to have a look at it. So once you have completed the learning modules and you completed the animal welfare learning module in LPA, you do receive this certificate of completion, and it's important that you have that, because if you are LPA audited, then that's one of the requirements, is that you have completed the training, so that someone in the business has completed the training. So please make sure when you're doing your accreditation that you complete that learning module in animal welfare. So there are a lot of resources that can help you manage your LPA requirements, and the LPA fact sheets and checklists are one example of some of the resources that we have, and we will be giving you lots of links to all of our resources in the post-webinar email. As we covered a little bit last time and also mentioned a few times tonight, the LPA learning modules give you the overview of all the requirements for LPA. And I would really encourage anyone who is in your business or is responsible for handling livestock on your property to be familiar with the content in each of these modules. The website, as I mentioned, is a great place to get information. So you've got a whole heap of information about LPA on the ISC website, but you also don't forget that when you log into your LPA website, that's where you can access the templates. If you want to upload some of your record keeping or all of your record keeping into your LPA account, you can do that. As we talked about last week, you can download templates, complete them, scan them and upload them, or you can complete the biosecurity plan and the property risk assessment completely online. And we are across the social and digital channels, and do send you the Integrity Matters newsletter every month. So I hope you've been enjoying the articles we've been having lately. We've had quite a bit of feedback on the sort of integrity insights, the integrity tips articles that are really focusing on the things that you need to do to meet your requirements. So I might just hand back over to Dee, because we've hopefully still got maybe 1 minute left for questions.
All good. Thanks so much, Jo. Such a great deep dive into those final 4 requirements, and some really great tips about how we can be rolling those requirements out on our properties. So folks, I'm just going to put a couple of questions to the team, but firstly, I just want to draw your attention to the chat box. I mentioned that we had a little evaluation survey just to get your feedback on the session. So if you have a minute, it is short, sharp and shiny, I promise. We'd love to get your feedback and any other suggestions you might have on topics that we should be doing going forward. Now, 2 questions. So the first one I'm going to put to Emily Duncanson, who is the ENVD product manager for ISC. Now, we had 42% of people on the call using ENVD, and everyone else is a potential ENVD user, Em. So can you give us some insight into what is coming up for ENVD from your point of view?
Yeah, thanks, Dee, and really happy to see those stats. So thank you to everyone on the call who has had a crack or does want to have a crack at ENVD. We do have some exciting improvements coming with the system. So I think, as Jo mentioned, we are continuously improving it based on what we understand about your requirements and the feedback that we get from all of our users. Some of the big ticket items that we're looking to provide to our users in the next 6 to 12 months include basically a new look and feel, which starts to really simplify, again, the way we ask questions, but also just is a much cleaner, easier navigation. It helps you through some of those tricky things like the consign and the destination. So that's what will be coming up next. As part of that, we're also starting to shift to a QR code solution, which will form part of our offline availability. So one of the biggest hurdles that we have for users is that majority of the time when you're creating NVDs, you're wanting to do it in an offline scenario, which our current ENVD doesn't support well. But we are creating a mobile app and other technologies, as I mentioned, like a QR code that enables you to do these consignments offline and transfer them to people that you'll need to. And then as we go further into the future, obviously ISC in general, and as Joe mentioned, we're looking to make sure that our systems are integrated and connected and provide one experience for users. So as we get out towards the 12-month mark, we'll be looking for opportunities to integrate with NLIS so that your movement records are done for you when you use ENVD. And I guess all of that aligns well back to the LPA requirements and just really helping you to meet those and automating all of those processes for you. So yeah, some exciting things on the horizon. And in the meantime, we will continue to make small improvements that help you along the way while we're working on some of these bigger features.
Awesome. Thanks, Em. Some really exciting stuff coming down the pipeline for people who are ENVD users or hopefully about to give it a crack. Now, Kathleen, we'll come back across to you for the final question of the night. And folks, just a final call for any questions you might have, pop them in the Q&A now so the team can answer them before we finish the session. But Kathleen, I just want to ask you that, I guess, maybe you're new in your, livestock keeping career, or, maybe finding this a bit sort of overwhelming. When it comes to the record keeping component, what are ISC's recommendations on that point of record keeping?
Yeah, thanks, Dee. So as we said tonight, record keeping is really important. It's really important so that you can go back and accurately fill out your national vendor declaration, for example. It's also really useful for and important for auditing purposes if you are asked to participate in an audit, but it also makes sense from a business point of view, and your record keeping can also go across other programs. So whilst you might be keeping records for LPA, for example, it might also be the same records that you're required to keep as part of your chemical user accreditation, for example, and things like that. So records are critical. Yes, we need to do them, but there are some fairly intuitive ways of doing them. We don't need to overthink it, and there's no one size fits all. However, Integrity Systems Company has a range of, starting points. You don't have to go to the top end third-party software solution straight away. I'd go to the Integrity Systems Company website and check out the checklists and the fact sheets that Joe talked about. We've also got some record keeping templates there, which are on the verge of being updated, and we'll share those with everybody that's registered for the webinar as well. So they'll be available as a Word document, as an Excel spreadsheet, or as a fillable PDF or something you can write on by hand. But yeah, I'd go to the Integrity Systems Company website. It's a bit of a one-stop shop. We've also got links off to YouTube in terms of other assets and things like that as well that you can draw on. But yeah, Integrity Systems Company website, best place to start.